Director of Beyond Pesticides. You already know that. And you know Dr. Shanna Swan, who is the author of Countdown. And you've just heard her talk to the conference. So this is our incredible opportunity to have a Q&A with Dr. Swan, who's been working for decades, as you heard, on this issue of endocrine disruption and how it crosses chemical exposures. A lot of work has been done on phthalates, but how that intersects with pesticides as well. And not only the health side, but the beauty of a scientist looking at these issues is to sort of look below the surface a little bit of how we regulate these chemicals and where those deficiencies are, so we can connect some of the dots and think about what strategies we need to correct these problems and survive as a species, hopefully. So I'm not going to leave a lot of time here for introductions. I think people want to get right into the questions, if that's okay, Dr. Swan?
Sure.
Yeah, well, thanks again for joining us today, this afternoon. The questions are already coming in, and let me look at this first one here. A peer-reviewed paper is about to be published showing that exposure to Roundup during pregnancy, and this is your work,
right.
During pregnancy reduces anogenital distance in humans. Do you want to delve into that a little bit? I guess Warren Porter, another one of our board members, Professor Emeritus at University of Wisconsin-Madison, is keeping up with the literature there. So if you could just fill us in a little bit on this study, it sounds.
No, I just want to say hello to Warren Porter.
Okay.
Yeah, so I got involved with this question of glyphosate about 2 years ago through my colleague Jia Chen at Mount Sinai, who's been working with Ramazzini on a very large animal study looking at reproductive effects of glyphosate. And in that study, they observed a longer anogenital distance in rodents. And she brought me in because she knows that I'm, I toot the horn for anogenital distance as a marker of reproductive dysfunction. And so we looked at the data, and that paper out of Ramazzini was published. Then we decided to look in the cohort study that I was PI of. I've since stepped down as PI, and now Sheila Satyanaranya in University of Washington is PI, but I'm still an investigator. And in that new study, we decided to look at a sample. We had no money, wasn't funded to look at glyphosate, but Gia found some money to look at 100 kids. So we looked at AGD in 100 kids in our TIDES cohort. This is a 4-center cohort study. And AGD had been measured because we showed that AGD was related to phthalate exposure. And yes, we did see a longer anogenital distance in females exposed prenatally to glyphosate. Now, as I say, this is a very small study. It's just been published, and I think that's the one Warren Porter is referring to. If it's not, I'd like to hear. But we are now in the process of applying for a multi-center study to look at this in a bigger way. And what I was saying earlier was that this is really, really important for 2 reasons. One, because glyphosate is, of course, the most widely used pesticide in the world, but also because, to my knowledge, this would be the first environmental androgen. And this is so unusual because for years I've asked chemists, we have anti-androgens, we have pro-estrogens. Where are the pro-androgens? Where are the things that act as androgens during development? And so stress maybe, but as far as an environmental exposure, I don't know of any. So if people want to chime in there and suggest some, I would love to hear about it. But in any case, this is a new question and an important question, and we'll see where it goes. It's preliminary.
Yes. Well, that's where it starts, right? So thank you for that. Someone was asking about, let's see, I apologize for that. Someone was asking about the actual products that you're tying to endocrine disruption. You mentioned the phthalates. Can you give us a broad swath of the types of products we're seeing out in the marketplace that one would encounter?
So products and chemicals, of course, want to separate that, right? So when you say products, are you talking about things like Teflon pans and
that kind of thing?
Okay, all right. So, and I think in my presentation I did show some pictures of some of these products, but I think my work has been primarily on phthalates and secondarily on phenols, with some work on pesticides. I have not done a lot of work on the PFAS chemicals nor the flame retardants. But where those are is more clear cut, and I think their name, flame retardants, of course, they're in cushions and things you don't want to catch on fire in the home, and kids' pajamas and all that. But the PFAS are more difficult because they tend to be in barriers. I think of them as barriers. So barriers in the frying pan, barriers in our waterproof garments, barriers in paper. So wherever barriers are introduced, and there are other barriers which are not PFAS, for example, tin cans, that's definitely a barrier of phenol. So barriers are really important. As far as the phthalates, that's a different class of chemicals because their functions are different. So their functions are to increase absorption, to make plastic soft and flexible, and to retain color and scent. So depending on which phthalate and which function you're looking at, the products will be different. So obviously retaining scent, you put that in scented products. As far as retaining color, you put it in colored products like lipstick and rouge and nail polish. And as far as absorption, you put it in sunscreen and skin products that you want to be absorbed into your skin. And then what's most tricky, I think, is the soft, flexible plastic use. And that is how I think most of the phthalates are getting into our bodies, because that is so pervasive, especially now in the time of COVID, by the way. We're all surrounded with these soft plastics. And, we used to say that the primary source of exposure to these phthalates was through food that's been processed, food that's been packaged in plastic, food that's been microwaved in plastic, transported in plastic. But I would like to see a new evaluation of that in the time of COVID. I just don't know if that balance is going to change. But in any case, those are certainly ways that we're exposed to these chemicals.
Yeah, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned phthalates had been an inert ingredient, which is a non-disclosed ingredient in pesticide formulations, meaning it's not on the product label. You can't determine it by looking at the product information. It's considered proprietary information. So your best understanding now is that that's been removed mostly by manufacturers, if maybe totally?
No, I wouldn't say that necessarily. I would say it has been removed from the list of inert ingredients. Whether it has actually been removed from the pesticides, that's a different question.
Yeah.
So I know that it has the property of increasing absorption, so that if you wanted for a pesticide to get into a plant, and you want to help that would be a good thing to put in there. So whether it's DEP or DBP or something, those are put in personal care products for absorption. And I would not be surprised, let's say, if they were still in pesticides, but I don't know that.
Yeah. Well, that again raises an exposure conundrum, right? Because we often can't determine what our exposures are as a result of it being in a non-disclosed category when it comes to pesticides, of course. Sticking with personal care products, are you aware of any action at FDA or discussion to eliminate phthalates from personal care products, especially cosmetics?
Not in this country. This is not my work. I've heard this from sources I believe that there are 1,100 products that are banned from personal care products in Europe, and 11, contrasted to 1,100 in the United States. So I'd love to get a real citation for that rather than, reading about it somewhere or hearing about it somewhere. But it's certainly true that in the EU, there is much stricter regulation of phthalates in all kinds of products. And so and they've done a lot more work on exposure sources and so on. So I believe that is going on there. I'm not aware of anything going on this side of the pond.
Okay. Here's a question that touches on epigenetics, transgenerational effects. Is there any thinking that pesticide-induced oxidative damage to the mother's mitochondria might lead to generational damage? Does that come up in any of your work?
Not only do I not know about transgenerational transmission of mitochondrial damage, I have not studied, and I don't know specifically damage to the mitochondria, although it's a very interesting hypothesis, but I haven't studied that. I haven't read about that, sorry.
Well, I'm sure this group is going to give you a whole lot more suggestions on what to study, but as you've shown us, you can spend a lifetime just sort of uncovering, right, the challenges of this particular adverse effect. I'm interested, given all your work and especially your reference toward the end of your presentation, where you essentially were listing the kinds of things EPA ought to do, and FDA and other regulatory agencies, to adequately evaluate endocrine disrupting effects, looking at low dose effects, mixtures, and a whole bunch of risks associated with untested effects. Do you ever get to the point, and do you think it's justifiable for the scientific community to be advocating for a precautionary approach to the regulation of these materials? More like what was in Europe?
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, we can't ever escape this regrettable substitution cycle that we're in. We can't take a BPF or a BPS and assume it's safe. I think we must assume that if it's structurally similar to BPA, that it is likely going to pose a similar risk and cannot be, I think, introduced into our baby bottles and our water bottles and our tin cans until its safety has been established. I absolutely think this is what has to be done.
And of course, that's going to take or require, I should say, a political debate, which is a problem at this stage in our history. Have you come across a greater responsiveness to science in the policy arena, or do you have a sense that science, if taken more seriously in this new administration, could affect the kinds of policy changes we need? Is there any evidence of that in your world?
Just personally, I would say I'm thrilled by the number of legislators and governmental groups that have asked me to speak and have asked me for advice, and they're coming to me. I never saw this before. Of course, I never wrote a book before, I've talked to the President's Task Force on Children's Environmental Health. I've talked to other groups in the EPA. I've talked to somebody in the Senate, in the House Oversight Committee. I've talked to people in individual state legislatures. So I'm actually willing to talk to anybody who will listen, or to help spread the word and have other people talk to those legislators. I think that's what we're going to have to do. We have to put out this really wide net where we spread this information, because still shockingly, most people don't know what endocrine disruption is. Most people don't know there's a reproductive crisis. Most people don't know that the dangers of pesticides. So we have an education problem first, and until we have overcome that or made progress in that, we're not going to get regulation change because there's not going to be pressure for that. So we have to exert that pressure.
Yeah. So that's good news to hear your experience, because certainly there have been too numerous number of examples to suggest that science has been ignored, and this area of science in particular. In your book, and I think in your talk as well, you talk not only about specific effects like sperm count, but you talk about the more generalized effects of endocrine disruptors to overall health. Can you explore that a little more? Can you tell us how that those mechanisms you think are working to affect overall health?
Well, for my talk in the book, that I study prenatal exposure, right. And when you alter hormonal development in sensitive periods in prenatal exposure, you're going to affect multiple systems that are developing at the same time. So there's not a lot of evidence that, for example, when sperm counts are low or men are infertile, that they actually have a lifetime of increased health problems, such as heart disease, diabetes, reproductive cancers, and even earlier mortality, earlier age of death, which is kind of surprising. This has just come out in the last couple of years. Women also who have impaired reproductive function have problems with reproductive cancers and lifetime health problems. So what's happening, I think, is that you don't alter one system. You don't just alter the reproductive system. And in fact, there are scientists and clinicians who now say that reproductive health should be considered the sixth vital sign because it's a signal for overall health. Okay. That said, there are other systems that are affected by endocrine disruption, of course. We've done a lot of work on neurodevelopment, and many scientists have, of course. And in our studies, we look at the neurodevelopmental health of children in our studies and see associations with endocrine disruptors, as have many groups. And there are other scientists who look at other outcomes. For example, look at endocrine disruptors as obesogens, or look at endocrine disruptors as immune dysregulators through the thyroid disruption, and so on. So I think it's probably the case that there's not a single system of the body, because it's all controlled by hormones, that is not going to be impacted by probably multiple endocrine disruptors.
Yeah. And that's, looking at this holistically in terms of our overall health is, I think, going to be a critical issue. Of course, your book gets a lot of attention as well because you're focusing on an adverse outcome that attracts people's attention, and people are experiencing these problems in their own personal lives. So it's very timely, I think, in that respect. So I think you just touched on this question about timing of exposure. Beyond the womb, are there critical windows of vulnerability that we should be aware of and policymakers should be aware of? Talking about endocrine disruptors?
Yeah. So clearly the prenatal exposure is the best studied among low-level exposures, right? Population-based low-level exposures. The periods that are most sensitive are the periods where there is the greatest cell division, the greatest change. Rate of change is greatest, of course, prenatally, but also in the immediate postpartum period, there's a period known as mini puberty, which is actually in 3 to 6 months of age, is probably very sensitive, but there's been very little work done on it. And then the prepubertal period is another period of rapid hormonal change that is probably sensitive. And just to, it's been shown, I worked in oral contraceptives a long, long time ago, and we knew that there was more of an impact on health from oral contraception when girls started very early in that pre-pubertal period. Same thing with cigarette smoking. They like to get people hooked on smoking while they're adolescents, very early. So then they're hooked for life. So that's that formative period, that pre-pubertal, early pubertal period that I think is very, very sensitive. And then, of course, when women themselves are pregnant, and very little work has been done on that, but it really should be studied because women are themselves going through lots and lots of changes when they carry a baby. And the effects of these chemicals on the mother as opposed to on the offspring have been understudied. So I would say there are probably other sensitive periods which are much less studied.
Yeah. Well, we will leave it there. Thank you so much for being with us again. And I know you have an incredibly busy schedule, so we really appreciate you taking the time with us today. And just an announcement, was there anything else you wanted to end with? Did I spark any thoughts that I didn't ask you a question about?
No, you encourage me to spend more time thinking about pesticides.
Oh, good.
I think that's incredibly important. I've always talked about the safety of our food, but and we've shown that pesticide-free foods are, for example, better for sperm count.
Right.
So I really applaud what you're doing and appreciate your work.
Back at you. We really appreciate you being here.